Hello everybody. I'm going to run through this new presentation on NAC and cysteine, and this presentation's taken a lot of time. I think I was trying to have it done by last weekend or so, and today's Wednesday, so obviously hasn't happened yet, and I'll show you why. And it's obviously because some of the information's a bit more complicated than a simple review of the research. So let's start here on about the second page of the presentation. What do you know about cysteine, acetylcysteine, or NAC? So I start with a few basic questions. Obviously, cysteine is an amino acid. It's a component of glutathione. It's mucolytic mostly when inhaled, but some mucolytic benefit, like in the lungs, for example, can be achieved with oral supplementation. Obviously, NAC is most famous for its role in the production of glutathione, especially in the clinical setting of acetaminophen, or also called paracetamol, overdose or poisoning, especially suicide attempts. So that's basically goes by the brand name of Tylenol. When people overdose on Tylenol, usually to try to kill themselves, NAC is one of the standard remedies for that problem. So people are brought into the hospital. They're usually semi-conscious or unconscious, and they are given NAC either intravenously, or if they're considered to be within 8 hours of poisoning, then they can also be treated orally. And oral treatment and intravenous treatment carry about the same effectiveness within the first 8 to 10 hours. After that, intravenous treatment appears a little bit better, but intravenous treatment with NAC is also more risky because some patients have like an allergic type reaction to it and can go into shock basically. And obviously that would be on top of being poisoned. So then not only are they poisoned with Tylenol, but then they also go into shock from the NAC, and that of course becomes a bigger mess. So I consider all that relatively basic. So everybody should know it's an amino acid, it's part of glutathione, it's mucolytic. It has FDA approval for its mucolytic effect and also for Tylenol overdose. So now let's get into a few things that are a bit more advanced. So it's not an essential amino acid, but it is considered a conditionally essential amino acid, and it's probably the best example of conditional essentiality. Sometimes it's considered the rate-limiting amino acid for glutathione, but all of the amino acids for glutathione are considered rate-limiting, which is a bit unusual. But actually, it does make some sense through a pathway that I'll show you in just a minute, and that is all of these amino acids can be created from other amino acids, but they also support, those three amino acids support each other. So for example, if you give someone NAC, that will raise their glycine and glutamine levels. And likewise, if you give someone glutamine, that will also raise their cysteine and glycine levels. So I'll show you that maybe towards the end if we have time to run through some PDF documents. Like I said before, it's mucolytic, mostly via the inhalational route for the lungs, but some benefit with oral supplementation. Actually significant benefit, so it's not like it just barely works. It actually works quite well. It might not work acutely. So in those, if someone's having an acute asthma or bronchitis attack, then of course oral might be a bit slower than the inhalational route, which would be expected to work within a few minutes. Again, it's a remedy for acetaminophen overdose. As I said before, oral within 8 to 10 hours or thereafter by intravenous route. Usually 150 milligrams per kilogram, which is about 10 grams for a so-called typical adult. Cysteine is catabolized or destroyed in the liver in response to interleukin-6 mediated inflammation, probably a few other cytokines as well. So the significance of that is anytime you look at somebody who's in an inflammatory state, and the way you would know is by measuring their high sensitivity C-reactive protein, because HS-CRP, the CRP protein, is produced in the liver in response to inflammation, specifically due to interleukin-6. So if you see someone with an elevated CRP level, you know they've got elevated interleukin 6, and if they have elevated interleukin 6, then they are destroying their cysteine, and so their glutathione levels will also be lower. And that, of course, some of you might appreciate, becomes a vicious cycle. So as people are more inflamed, they undergo more oxidative stress, but the inflammation itself destroys cysteine, which then lowers their glutathione levels. So the inflammation, which creates oxidative stress, actually depletes the body from being able to defend itself from oxidative stress. So that's important. The neuropsychiatric benefits of NAC really deserve a lot of attention these days, and I've got a lot of information ready on that. And I'll talk about that in this kind of rough draft or run through this presentation. So reasonable would be for everybody to appreciate how NAC helps the brain, and I'll show you a diagram that I made on that. And then finally, everybody should know, of course, the dosages of NAC in different clinical settings, and also the Synergies. So when we talk about Synergies, we could talk about biochemical Synergies if the goal is to create more glutamine, if the goal is to create more glutathione. So obviously glutamine would be a Synergist there, obviously glycine. So, we could look at this from a synergistic standpoint if we're only thinking about glutathione. But if we're thinking clinically, then we would pick a different list of Synergists based on whatever the clinical situation is. And in this case, of course, I'm trying to focus on antiviral treatments. So that's me. There's my book. And then we'll go through a few of the slides from the previous part 1 introduction, which I just refreshed recently. So, like I've said now for a couple of years, I think everybody should understand kind of the basic components of a viral infection. If we're going to say that we're treating them, then we at least ought to know what it is that we're treating. I've studied this quite a bit. Again, like I said in part 1, I think the best training I got was in naturopathic school. I had already taken basic microbiology, so we had clinical microbiology, and we also had an immunology class. And even to this day, I remember things that I learned in that class, even though it was 20 years ago. We all know that vaccines are a big issue. I mentioned that before. Doctors don't get any training in vaccines in medical school or residency programs, and this is well known, and now it's well documented. And then, yet, despite that level of ignorance, also being ignorant in nutrition, as we all know, they maintain their ignorance in nutrition, but then they endorse vaccines. And of course, we're all aware of that now. And the reason we're aware of it is because politicians, maybe worldwide, but especially in the US, are able to receive money from the drug companies. So of course they push the drug agenda, and now that has totally taken over the United States. So, 5 years ago, who cared? It was barely on the horizon, but now, I can hardly believe the changes that have happened in the United States, especially with regard to this issue. But now, all of a sudden you're hearing measles, vaccines, influenza. Now vaccines are mandatory in many states. You have to have vaccines for certain jobs, which wasn't required previously. They were always optional. Now they're mandatory. I had to get vaccinated just to go to medical school. They tried to force me to get vaccinated when I was working in the hospitals, which I refused that. Well, I refused that one, but I had to get vaccinated in medical school. But now kids have to get vaccinated to go to school. They have to get vaccinated with vaccines that are proven to not work, and that's totally stupid. And if you look at, for example, like the tetanus vaccine has never been tested, never, not once. Tetanus is also not a contagious disease. So why should anybody have to get vaccinated for tetanus just to go to work or go to school? I think it's completely ridiculous. Well, here's a recent publication from Medscape, which probably gets a couple of million views. Vitamins and supplements are a waste of money. And they've got this disc jockey here who probably knows nothing. He's probably never taken a nutrition class in his life. And certainly has not studied the topic legitimately. Here's an article I reviewed last year from JAMA, another nail in the coffin, and their typical ridiculousness. Despite the fact that nutrition indiscretion is killing more Americans than anything else, doctors remain untrained in nutrition. So, I mean, it's all political. People have been talking about the lack of training in nutrition now in medical schools for 20 years, 25 years. Nothing's changed. Everybody keeps saying, well, it's urgent. We have to change this. It's not going to change because the drug companies, own the politicians, and they own most of the medical schools too. So, if they had any intention, excuse me, if they had any intention to teach that material, they could have easily done so. Here are some reasons why doctors, even though they're ignorant about nutrition and ignorant about vaccines, they go on to embrace vaccines through financial and social and political pressure. I've called that the kind of power vortex of the pharmaceutical industry, and it just creates a vicious cycle, mostly of ridiculousness. It's a lot of these things don't have any data supporting them. Like the flu vaccine is worthless. Tetanus vaccine has never been tested. HPV vaccine is worse than worthless because it's very dangerous, and because it's relatively new, it's also expensive. So, for a kid, it's just ridiculous. So these days, a lot of American kids have to get the HPV vaccine just to go to school, which is ridiculous. But the HPV vaccine has never been proven to work, but it has been proven to be very dangerous, and it costs about $500 for a series of 3 injections. Well, $500 times millions of kids, that you're getting into millions and billions of dollars for a vaccine that has never been proven to work and has been proven to kill people. Something I talk about here, which obviously I'll go slower when I make the real recording, but I am trying to kind of give you a forecast of what I've been working on. Real viral infections contain a pro-inflammatory component, which is why a person feels sick when they have a viral infection. But real viral infections also have an anti-inflammatory component because viruses are inherently immunosuppressive. And the reason that viral infections, let's say, behave in an immunosuppressive way is because the virus has learned, through the process of evolution or whatever, certain techniques for suppressing the human immune system, like creating receptor blockers for cytokines, for example, and also kind of suppressing certain intracellular pathways. That creates an immunosuppressive effect by the virus, obviously, so the virus can survive. So what you see with real viral infections is a combination of pro-inflammatory effect and an anti-inflammatory effect. What you see with vaccines is only a pro-inflammatory effect. So it's not the same as a natural infection. It's not as effective for promoting immunity, and it's also more dangerous because vaccines are purely pro-inflammatory. They don't have any natural balance to them. So that's just more conversation on the same topic. We'll skip that for now. Obviously, you can stop the slides if you want to look at it. This is what I had proposed in video number 1 and also reviewed here as kind of a baseline question. What is a viral infection? Well, you have exposure to the virus has to enter the cells, the virus has to replicate, the immune system responds, and then we have systemic and cellular consequences. I'll show you in just a moment. All of those can be influenced by nutrition. So that's why I think that this antiviral protocol that I've been working on now for a long time, I actually started working on it when I was still practicing in Seattle, and that was back in 2000, because I graduated in 1999. So, here we are. I've been working on this now for 20 years at least. But anyway, these are the main steps of a viral infection, and each one of those provides an opportunity to intervene with nutrition. So I also said that we would look at question number 2 here. This is basically how medical doctors and medical students are taught, is by looking at a pathway like this, where the virus enters, it replicates, and then it explodes out of the cell. And this is what we call in medicine a viral infection. But if we look at viral infections this way, then we miss out on a lot of details. The reason that medical students are taught this type of model is because this is the template for how drugs work. So drugs work at all these numbered steps here. drugs don't work by strengthening barriers. Drugs don't work by, blocking NF-kappa B the way that nutrition does. Drugs don't work by supporting immune function. Drugs don't work by supporting glutathione. Drugs don't work through nutritional optimization like with vitamin A, vitamin D, zinc, selenium, etc. So this is only a pharmaceutical model of viral infection. This is not legitimate viral infection in the way that we would think of it from an integrated standpoint. So this is a very important point, because if doctors don't understand the completeness of what a viral infection is, and if this is the model that they have in their heads, then they're just going to think of antiviral drugs. Now, we could take that same model and plug and play nutrients, just like the drug companies plug and play drugs. But that is basically what I do in the protocol. So it's a simple model that basically services the pharmaceutical model for the use of drugs. If you look at antiviral strategies, again, from a medical standpoint, they never talk about nutrition, and I think, of course, that's ridiculous. So that's why we have to try to, change the paradigm, basically, and that's, again, of course, what I'm working on. Here's the list again of some of my publications. Everybody should be familiar with that by now. I talk about structure and context and all that. Definitions, clinical use, 4-part strategy. We'll review that right now again. Human patient evidence, and then I'll try to look at risk, benefit, cost effectiveness, etc. That's going to be some numbers and math and some attempts. I don't know if the data is really strong, or if I should say, I don't think the data is really clear necessarily. I mean, I have to go in there and kind of crunch the numbers, but I'll try to do that. So the 4 parts of the strategy, everybody should know that, I hope, by now. Number 1, the virus. You have to have exposure to the virus. It has to penetrate into the cell. And then sometimes we can also look at viruses from a mutation standpoint. RNA viruses, like the influenza virus, of course, those mutate very quickly. That's why they try to come up with a new vaccine every year, and that's why they fail miserably and ridiculously every year. The virus then has to replicate. We can control that with nutrition. The immune system, of course, needs nutrition. And then the systemic complications like mitochondrial impairment are also very important. And all of those we can influence with nutrition. So that's why, in my opinion, this protocol is so important. So, moving on from there, this pretty much says the same thing here. It's just a copy of the other page. So, what we're going to focus on in this detailing of the strategy is the role of NAC, acetylcysteine, N-acetylcysteine, or sometimes people call it NAC, even though I don't like saying that. It's FDA approved for acetaminophen toxicity, also for its mucolytic effect for people who are having like asthma or pneumonia or bronchitis exacerbations. And here's a document from the FDA talking about how it's approved for acetaminophen overdose and also for its mucolytic effect. So, moving on from there, this is an important page here, so I'll slow down just a little bit. Here are the mechanisms and actions and benefits of NAC. So we all know that it functions as an antioxidant. It functions as an antioxidant directly, but also through its production of glutathione. So cysteine by itself is an antioxidant. It does not have to be converted into glutathione, even though, of course, everybody knows about glutathione. So it's a direct antioxidant, and it's an indirect antioxidant via glutathione. It's a conjugating agent, so when toxins are consumed, like acetaminophen, for example, acetaminophen gets converted into a more toxic, what we call a toxic intermediate. That toxic intermediate has to be neutralized through a process of conjugation. Conjugation means joining things together. So if you join the toxic intermediate of acetaminophen with glutathione, you neutralize the toxic effect, and then it can be excreted. So glutathione is not only an antioxidant, but it's also a phase 2 conjugating agent, and it allows toxins to be bound to the glutathione so that they can be excreted either in the urine or through the bile. So that's number 2. Number 3, it's a mucolytic. Like I said before, it dissolves mucus, and people can cough up their mucus. If mucus gets too thick, people can't cough it up, so they can choke to death on their own mucus. if you can dissolve that mucus or water it down or thin it out with NAC, just like you can with iodine and iodide, then people can expectorate that mucus and they don't choke to death. NAC also dissolves biofilms. It gets a lot of press for this these days, and that helps it to be effective against the bacteria H. pylori. So if people have H. pylori and you use antibiotics with NAC, you get more benefit than with antibiotics alone. NAC is anti-inflammatory via its inhibition of the NF-kappa B pathway, which is a very important inflammatory pathway that everybody knows about. It helps to support immune function, so I call that immunopotentiation. It's not immune stimulation. It's, releasing the power and potency of the immune system, so I call it immunopotentiation. Antiviral, at least in part. I mean, it's antiviral for a couple of different mechanisms, but it blocks the NF-kappa B pathway, and the NF-kappa B pathway is used by viruses not simply for inflammation, but also for replication. So NAC functions to inhibit viral replication. It also helps to lower fever in some models. Not a lot of strong data on that in humans, which is ridiculous because it either works or it doesn't, and we need to know if it works or it doesn't. In the animal studies, it works quite well. In some case reports, it works quite well, but we need to know if it works in humans. Anti-catabolic and anti-cahexic, anti-wasting, spares glutamine. So when people are going through what's casually described as muscle wasting, like with advanced cancer or with chronic infections, especially HIV and AIDS, I call it muscle wasting because everybody understands what muscle wasting is. The medical term for it is cachexia, and that's what kills AIDS patients, and that's what kills cancer patients, is they just waste away. And you can imagine, what you see externally is muscle weakness. Their arms get really skinny. Sometimes they put on fat around the middle, but mostly what I'm talking about here is the muscle wasting. Well, what you see with their thin arms and legs is reflected in their gut and in their heart and their other organs. Everything is just dissolving basically because their bodies are eating up their protein stores. So again, that's called cachexia, and that's what kills, if it's not an opportunistic infection, that's what kills cancer patients and AIDS patients. So when we talk about an anti-wasting intervention, or if we talk about an anti-cahexic intervention, we would use NAC in that setting for sure if we were doing it right. Of course, it's usually not done right. The medical approach to treating muscle wasting is just to give people more sugar, and that sugar chocolate drink called Ensure. So it's guaranteed to ensure that you'll have more nutritional problems, I suppose. NAC is also mitoprotective, so it helps preserve mitochondrial function, not simply ATP production, but also the antiviral effect of mitochondria. It helps to protect the kidneys in various ways. It helps to protect the brain. We should call that neuroprotection, and also modulate neurotransmitter reception. So that's called neuromodulation. I'll talk about that more. I've got an image I worked on for a while. It lowers kynurenine. Kynurenines can be considered like inflammatory products of tryptophan, and they're mostly bad. They don't do anything good. They make people feel psychotic. They make people feel fatigued, and they're immunosuppressive, which has a role in tumor progression and also maybe some infections as well. NAC helps to enhance dopamine and also lowers glutamate in the brain, and that's exactly what you want most of the time. If everybody had more dopamine and less glutamate, people would be a lot happier and would have less consequence of neurodegeneration. NAC binds directly onto homocysteine, and that helps to lower homocysteine levels. So, you can use vitamins to lower homocysteine, obviously, and those, quite often work. But I think NAC works more consistently, let's say. And obviously, you can use vitamins and NAC together to lower homocysteine levels. Cysteine suppresses appetite. One recent study has shown that NAC supports fat loss while maintaining muscle mass. It also chelates certain toxic metals like arsenic and also methyl mercury. And very interestingly enough, NAC has been recently shown to be effective in the treatment of refractory thrombotic thrombocytopenic purpura, which is kind of this somewhat unusual autoimmune inflammatory type condition, and also the viral infection called dengue, which results in something called viral hemorrhagic fever. So that's my summary. I'm going to try to focus on topics number 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9 in this presentation. And that's much easier said than done, because this is a lot of information. And it ultimately becomes kind of a paradigm shift, in my opinion. So let's look at some of the benefits here. I'm going to try to keep this introductory video as short as possible. NAC helps to spare glutamine. So you'll see a relationship therapeutically between NAC and glutamine. If you give someone NAC, you help to spare the glutamine in their body. So it's almost like giving them NAC and glutamine at the same time, even though it's not the same, and we could do better if we gave NAC and glutamine at the same time. But it does spare glutamine. So if you don't spare glutamine and all the cysteine is getting catabolized, then the liver, not people necessarily, but the liver of people is going to try to pull glutamine from the tissues. Well, what tissues are those going to be? And what would be the consequences? So the glutamine is going to get pulled from muscles and the gut. That explains muscle wasting. That explains gut infections in these people. It also explains why they're predisposed towards, sepsis, which is basically a blood infection. Where does that so-called blood infection come from? It usually comes from the gut, because the gut has become so leaky due to gut wasting, which is the internal view of what we call muscle wasting. NAC also, as we already know, supports glutathione defenses. It helps to block mutation of viruses, because those mutations occur through free radicals. If we put in more antioxidants, we'll have fewer free radicals, therefore we will have fewer viral mutations, therefore we will have fewer uncontrolled viral infections. It helps to clear out mucus and supports the antiviral mechanism of mitochondria, and also helps to inhibit viral replication via the NF-kappa B pathway. And then I think I talk about that a little bit here. So, and I've got some other research I'm going to plug into this part when I finish the final video. So here's a supporting article. So we're talking about NF-kappa B as a target for antiviral chemotherapy. Nuclear NF-kappa B, a potential target for anti-HIV chemotherapy. And then I provide kind of a review there. So basically, again, NAC blocks NF-kappa B. NF-kappa B is hijacked by viruses for replication. So if we block that pathway, we are blocking viral replication. So we're slowing down the whole process. So mostly what I'm going to try to focus on in the literature review section of this video, of course, are the human clinical trials and review articles that are published in clinical medicine journals. So we're going to try to keep this as clinically relevant as possible. And then here I get into some of the articles, and they're not all positive, but the ones that aren't positive, we can understand why they're not positive. So, you know, this area of research has progressed, but it's also been retarded by some type of political demon, let's say. The research has basically stood still for 20 years, and there's really no parallel to that, and I don't see any excuse for it. So, like, I could pick up an article from 20 years ago, and it would look just like an article that I could read today. Like, there's no progress has been made in this field, except from the mid and late 1990s to the early 2000s. Nothing's advanced in the past 15 to 20 years, and it's pretty pathetic. So here's an article from 21 years ago. They used sodium selenite, which obviously is a form of selenium, and they used a reasonable dose, 500 micrograms. They used 600 milligrams 3 times per day of NAC, so that's 1800 milligrams. That's a reasonable dose, and they didn't get very good results here. So arguably, that form of selenium, even though it was popular a while ago, even it's less popular now. So maybe they used the right dose of selenium, but they didn't use the right form. I guess that could be argued. The dose of NAC, even though it was okay relative to some other studies at 1800 milligrams per day, was still pretty low. So they needed to use more NAC for, in my opinion, very obvious reasons. So let's just look at the overview here. These are HIV infected patients. By the time patients are, HIV positive and symptomatic and seeking out treatment, etc., they are already destroying or catabolizing their cysteine levels. So the rate of that destructive process, as you would expect, if it exists and if it's biochemical, then we should be able to measure it. And when it is measured, they find that the rate of destruction or catabolism of cysteine in these HIV positive patients is about 6 to 7 grams per day. Well, if these patients are consuming 6 to 7 grams per day of cysteine, then are we doing them any massive favor by giving them 1800 milligrams? Obviously not. That's only 1/3 or less of what they actually need. So what I see is that a lot of these studies are underdosed, and secondly, what I see is that they're not even close. They're underdosed, and they're not even close. Only a handful of studies have actually used a physiologic dose. So this is the same thing that we see with vitamin D studies when they use 400 or 800 international units, and then they call that vitamin D supplementation. That's not vitamin D supplementation. If people need 4,000 and we give them 400, that's only 10%. Same thing is true here. If people need 6 grams and we give them 600 milligrams, we're only giving them 10% of what they need. So that's barely even worth looking at, even though several studies have been published doing exactly that. Let's take a look at another study here. A small study, so only 10 participants, and they received 600 milligrams of NAC. So 600 milligrams for somebody who needs 6 grams is giving them only less than 10% of what they need. So if it were pure cysteine, then it would be 10%. But the acetyl group, of course, has some weight to it. So if we're giving someone any dose of NAC, they're obviously getting less cysteine per weight because some of the weight of the NAC is the acetyl group. Anyway, if a study only uses 10% of the necessary amount, is that really a study, or is that simply kind of a modified observation? So the dose was inadequate here, and nobody can say otherwise. I mean, it's obvious, painfully obvious that this dose was inadequate. So they barely got any increase in glutathione, and this was also seen in another study that used the same dose. So 600 milligrams, and this is the point that I'm making. 600 milligrams is too low for a severe clinical condition like HIV. So I'm shocked. This was relatively early in the day, so to speak, but even then they should have known better. By 2002, 2004, 600 milligrams is just too ridiculous. It's just inadequate, and so the results, of course, are going to be inadequate and underpowered as well. So, like I said before, by the time these patients arrive to the more severe grades of viral infections like AIDS, their catabolism of cysteine is 6 to 7 grams per day. So 600 milligrams is only 10% of what they need, and therefore it's completely inadequate. A lot of the studies use that dose. Some of them used 1800 milligrams at the most, and that's really insufficient. So like I just said, the acetyl group takes some space. So if we're using N-acetylcysteine as a form of cysteine, then we actually have to use more based on the amount of cysteine that we're aiming for. So if we're aiming for 6 grams of cysteine, we would have to use about 8 grams of NAC. Here's another study, NAC in acute viral hepatitis, presumably mostly hepatitis A. So again, look here, they used 600 milligrams per day, 200 milligrams 3 times per day. That's ridiculous. It's way too low. They didn't find any evidence of danger, but they also didn't find much benefit either. We already looked at this one. This is just kind of a placeholder. And I probably have another placeholder in here as well. So let's look at this. This is what I call cysteine sacrifice. Phase 1 would be a normal person, whoever that might be. So not too much inflammation, no infections, and just a normal person. So no sacrifice there. At phase 2, this is where patients are inflamed or infected, and cysteine is going to be sacrificed in the liver to spare glutamine. So cysteine and glutamine are both necessary for proper immune function, but really glutamine is necessary for survival, because without sufficient glutamine, the immune system is not going to work. So cysteine, like I said before, and as I'm saying now on this page, cysteine is sacrificed to spare glutamine in the early stages of infection. So these patients need more cysteine, and they can also benefit from more glutamine. Now, by the time we get to stage 3 or phase 3 of this cysteine sacrifice, now patients are depleted of cysteine, so they're totally empty. Their glutathione levels are low, their cysteine levels are low, their homocysteine levels are low, because they don't have any cysteine. If they don't have cysteine to spare glutamine, then they're also going to be low in glutamine. And that's what we see with muscle wasting or cachexia. And those patients are severely immunosuppressed because they lack cysteine and glutamine. So again, I call this the cysteine sacrifice. It starts out mild, where we have sufficient cysteine to spare glutamine, but eventually when cysteine is lost, then glutamine is also lost. And that's what we see in the later stages of AIDS and cancer wasting. If that were true, if cysteine were sacrificed to spare glutamine, then giving people glutamine should spare their cysteine as well, and that's been shown for the past 25 years. So the model makes sense. Now we're going to look at a few clinical studies very quickly. N-acetylcysteine for prophylaxis of ventilator-associated pneumonia. Very, very excellent study, in my opinion. Excellent insofar as it produced really great results with excellent safety, and could have changed the standard of care, and should change the standard of care. So one thing that I've already said is that for active infections and inflammation, we need to use higher doses, 4 to 6 grams per day, let's say. For preventive measures, so before any infection has occurred, 600 milligrams is a reasonable dose, 2 or 3 times per day. So what is ineffective for an active acute infection is effective for prevention. So, that goes across the board. We use lower doses for prevention than we do for active treatment. So here they use 600 milligrams per day, 600 milligrams twice per day, so 1200 milligrams, and they got major benefit in the prevention of pneumonia in patients who were hospitalized and who were on a ventilator. So that was great. And here, 1997, 22 years ago, here is the inspiration for my doing this video at all. 22 years ago, this study was published. This study should have been replicated, and this study, assuming that the results are confirmed, which they most likely would have been, this study should have changed the entirety of healthcare just based on one study. So what they showed here is that patients who take NAC, 600 milligrams twice per day, relatively low dose, but again, we're only looking for prevention here. We're not looking for active treatment. What they showed here is that patients who took 600 milligrams per day still had exposure to influenza, but they didn't actually get clinically sick. So, all this political ridiculousness about influenza. The vaccine obviously doesn't work and has never worked and is unlikely to ever work. But what does work is NAC. So neither the vaccine nor NAC prevents exposure, but what NAC does is it makes the infection so mild that it becomes clinically irrelevant. And that's what was shown here. Absolutely amazing study. This should have changed the way we view and manage viral infections. This was published in the European Respiratory Journal, again, 1997. Amazing study. Obviously, they could have used other nutrients like vitamin A, zinc, selenium, glutamine, vitamin D. Here's a single case report of a patient who had life-threatening influenza H1N1 associated pneumonia. So this patient was going to die. They used antiviral drugs. Nothing was helping this patient to survive. They gave the patient NAC. She felt better. Then they withdrew the NAC. They went from intravenous high dose to oral low dose, and that has no justification. So the NAC high dose was very reasonable. They switched her to oral low dose. They didn't justify why they did that. And then the patient crashed again. So in hospital medicine, when patients are doing well, we of course say, great, they're doing well. When they start to crash, we call that either crashing or crumping. So she was crashing on her way in. They gave her NAC. She felt better. She was recovering. They took away the NAC, and then she crashed again. So that's actually pretty good data, even though it's only a single individual. So that shows it was safe and effective in that case. N-acetyl cysteine improves oxidative stress and inflammatory response in patients with pneumonia. 1,200 milligrams. Again, that's too low of a dose in patients with acute infection. And they only looked for biochemical improvements. They really didn't look for, clinical effectiveness. So that's just, I don't see any excuse for that. This was published in 2018. Why are they doing a study in 2018 with a single nutrient underdosed and not looking for clinical benefit? So, number one, they should have used a higher dose. Number two, they should have used other nutrients to go along with the NAC. And number three, they should have done this to make it real and look for real clinical benefit. They hardly did that here. They were mostly, not mostly, their primary outcome that they were looking for was biochemical. So, here I just talk about how to critique research. We'll skip that for now. I talked about this the other day online. Antiviral drugs and anti-HIV drugs are a $30 billion industry, and I suspect that amount of money is going to crush any interest in looking at nutrition, because, let's say that you're a researcher, let's say that you're a neutral PhD researcher, and you're looking to do antiviral research for whatever. Are you going to go to a nutrition company and try to get $20,000, $60,000, something like that? Or are you going to go to a drug company and do a multi-site, multi-year study and get, $5 million? Something like that. So, these huge studies that are funded like through Oxford and Cambridge and things like that, those are the studies that get published in, the big journals. And those are $1 million studies. This is just a placeholder. We're going to skip this page. And then I start talking about doses here. So hold on a second. I realize we're going back and forth here. So let's look at this. Like I said before, oral overdose is just going to give people heartburn. Intravenous so-called overdose or hypersensitivity can result in kind of like an allergic response where people kind of look like they're going into anaphylaxis. Gastrointestinal hemorrhage has also been reported, but who knows if that's really due to the NAC or if it's due to the vomiting or if it's due to the Tylenol toxicity. So preventive dose, 1,200 milligrams. Treatment dose, a reasonable treatment dose is 2.5 up to almost 4 grams per day. For autoimmunity, the dose is 4.8 grams per day, so 4,800 milligrams. So I think that this is a reasonable kind of summary. And then on the next two slides, I talk about ways to kind of fine tune that dose. For example, you can look at serum glutamate, serum glutamine. You can look at glutathione levels if you're working with a patient who's got HIV. You could look at viral load and CD4 count. And obviously you want to look at how they clinically respond in order to fine tune the dose. But why would we spend, a lot of brain power trying to figure out what's the perfect dose of NAC for whatever disease if we're not even giving the cofactors that go along with it? So, if we try to debate, should we give this patient 4 grams per day or should we give them 6 grams per day? Give them 5 grams a day and move on to the next topic, because the next topic is what are the synergistic factors that go with NAC to help it work biochemically, as I show you here, and help it work clinically, as I show you here. So, these studies should be using NAC with glycine, glutamine, selenium, riboflavin, niacin, magnesium, and CoQ10. That's just for general effect. If we're specifically looking for an antiviral effect, we should be using NAC, selenium, zinc, vitamin A, vitamin D, lipoic acid, melatonin, and whey protein. So then I get into some conversation here that's a little bit more detailed. I haven't looked at this since I originally made these slides, so I'm going to skip over it for now, and I'll look at it when I make the final pass. So let's see. Here's what I had started to talk about at the beginning of this presentation, and that is the neurologic or psychiatric benefit of NAC. And it basically comes down to this. Inside the brain is what's called a glutamate cysteine antiport system, and that just basically means exchange. So cysteine enters the cell, cysteine enters the cell, and glutamate exits. When that happens, when the glutamate exits the cell, it actually interacts with another glutamate receptor, which is called a metabotropic receptor. When we stimulate the metabotropic glutamate receptor, that actually reduces the amount of glutamate that's released at the end of the synapse. So more glutamate stimulation of the metabotropic receptor leads to reduced neurotransmitter receptor activation. So you give people cysteine, let's say that they release their glutamate, and that ultimately means less glutamate at the receptor, and that means we're happy. So I've got lots of research on that. So this is what I showed you before. Here's a really complex summary page that I then summarized on this page instead. And this is the important part here. When people are infected or inflamed, they destroy cysteine to save or salvage their glutamine. If that doesn't happen, then they go into protein catabolism. Eventually they're depleted of cysteine and glutamine, and then they enter into this muscle wasting state. Those are a few of the better citations. This guy, Wolf Droge, was really the originator of a lot of this data. He's now passed on, but his insights were amazing even for the 1990s. They would still be incredible even today, but most of his data is now being ignored. And you know how it is. People go, what moves the market is profit. So that's why his data is being ignored, because it's not as profitable as a $30 billion, antiviral drug market. So that's the quick overview. I'll try to eventually finish up this presentation and make it very polished, but that's going to take another week and a half or so. But that's and you can see how complicated this material is. I still have a lot of other clinical studies to put in here, and even going through it very fast took the better part of an hour. So that gives you some idea of what we're looking at. But again, people need to use more NAC. They need to use it for viral infections and neuropsychiatric conditions. Let's go back and look at the doses that I did talk about, even though we really shouldn't talk about dose unless we're going to talk about synergism as well. But these are kind of the standard doses that we should be using. 600 milligrams twice a day, that's very reasonable. That's what I take for preventive medicine reasons. For preventive medicine reasons. For neuropsychiatric problems and active viral infections, 2,400 to 3,600 milligrams per day is reasonable. We can go up to 6 grams per day. And one of the studies I just read this past week did use 6 grams per day. And that's one of the better studies. They showed improved survival and other benefits in patients with HIV. For autoimmunity, like, big time autoimmunity like lupus and rheumatoid arthritis, 4,800 milligrams per day is the kind of standard dose. So, based on that standard dose, we could probably use less if we use biochemical synergists, and then we have the other category of clinical synergists, depending on what exactly it is that we're treating. So that is the summary of this quick overview, and this is kind of the rough draft of the presentation that I will eventually finish up and polish up. Thank you much, and if you have any suggestions for making this better, please let me know and I'll fold that into the final version.